Hello everyone and welcome to this year's summer edition of the LogicLounge with Cory Doctorow. Today I'm very excited to have Cory as our speaker. For those of you who don't know Cory, let me give you a quick introduction. He's a science fiction author, activist and journalist. He's the author of many books ranging from picture books for young readers such as Poesy the Monster Slayer, which came out this month, to science fiction books for adults such as Radicalized and Walk Away, and young adult novels like Little Brother and Homeland, which got reissued this month with a new introduction from Edward Snowden. Besides being an author, he also works for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and he's an MIT Media Lab research affiliate, a visiting professor at Open University and the University of North Carolina School of Library and Information Science, and he's the co-founder of the UK-based Open Rights Group. Today, Cory is talking about working as intended. Surveillance capitalism is not a rogue capitalism. And with that, I will hand over to Cory.
Hi, you can see me, I take it, and hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi. So thank you for having me on. I'm sorry about that little technical problem. If only there was someone around here who understood technology who could help me out with this stuff. That all said, yeah, thanks for having me on. And I want to talk to you today about what I think is going on with technology and how that's different from the story we tend to tell ourselves about what's going on with technology. So before the coronavirus pandemic hit, there was another pandemic that a lot of us were very worried about, a kind of epistemological pandemic, a collapse in our trusted institutions and a rise in conspiracism, right? Rather than believing what expert bodies told us, we started to believe what individuals told us, and especially when they told us that the expert bodies were lying. We didn't just disagree about what was true, we disagreed about how you would find out what was true, how you would know whether something was true or not. And the received wisdom is that this arose because big tech figured out how to brainwash us with algorithms, right? That somehow by collecting enough data on us and then using machine learning, they could figure out how to build what amounted to a mind control ray that they could sell to unscrupulous hucksters who could turn it on us and get us to believe all kinds of outlandish things. But I think that's wrong. I actually don't think that's what happened at all. I'm going to talk about what I do think happened. But just because I don't think that big tech has a mind control ray, it doesn't mean that I think that big tech should be let off the hook. I actually think big tech is entirely responsible, well, largely responsible for what's going on, but not because they have mind control. So let's start with what big tech, we know big tech can actually do, right? What the things that are uncontroversial about big tech's capabilities. The thing that big tech is best at, more than anything else, is finding people with hard to find traits. And that has a lot to do with the advertising nature of big tech, right? That if you're in the advertising business, you are first and foremost in the finding people business. I mean, consider the plight of the poor refrigerator salesperson. You know, the median person buys one or fewer refrigerators in their whole life. So how do you find someone who wants to buy a refrigerator, right? The correlates of imminent refrigerator purchasing are very weak and diffuse. I mean, this is why when you leave an airport, I mean, do you remember when we used to leave airports? But why when you leave an airport, there's billboards by the side of the road that say, you know, buy a fridge. It's not because aviation is correlated with refrigerator buying, but aviation is correlated with money, right? Like you can't buy a plane ticket without a substantial amount of disposable income. And people with disposable income might buy a fridge. And certainly people without disposable income aren't going to buy a fridge. And so the thinking goes, people with money might buy a fridge. Let's advertise fridges where people have money. This is not an effective way to sell a fridge, right? The conversion rate for sticking a billboard by the side of the 280 or the, you know, the any other airport motorway that says, you know, you've had a lovely plane journey, now buy a refrigerator, that conversion rate is like 0.000000001%. So it's not very effective. So along comes big tech, along comes surveillance capitalism. They spy on everything we do. And so they can figure out some stronger correlates of imminent fridge purchasing, like reading refrigerator ads, or going to refrigerator repair fora, or reading reviews, or looking up where to find someone who does home renovations and kitchen remodeling. All of those are still very weak signals of refrigerator purchasing. They may only be a 0.000001% correlate of refrigerator buying, but that still might be thousands of times more effective than sticking a billboard by the highway. So big tech does not have to even be good at making things happen, at converting a message to an action, for it to be very valuable. Because if you're in the fridge selling business, thousands and thousands of multiples of improvement on your advertising strategy is worth a lot of money, even if the overall strategy wastes more than way more than 99% of the money you spend. So that's what big tech gets us. And in the social arena, finding people is also very powerful, right? So if you are trying to figure out what it means that you have this feeling somewhere inside of you that you can't quite express, that your gender is fluid, you've never even heard of such a thing, you can type a few words into a search engine and you can find people who have the same views as you. And moreover, the search engine can notice that you're thinking about this, and they can start to recommend videos to you about it and other information about it. And so if you are primed to want to understand more about the ways in which gender is non-binary, big tech and its people finding mechanism, both working through pull and push, both through people seeking out information and information being given to people on the basis of what they've sought out, those two can combine to make powerful social changes, right? To establish this burgeoning new norm about how we think about gender. It's also a way to find people who think that Black Lives Matter, right? Which was an idea that was pretty heterodox until pretty recently. And obviously there's still some people who virulently disagree with it. But without that networking power, right? Without the ability for people who are themselves asking questions that they can't say aloud to the people around them for fear of social sanction, and without that ability for people who are organizing shifts in our social discourse to be found by the people who are primed to hear their message, our social movements would move much more slowly. There'd be a lot more friction in them. And I say that as someone who, spent his adolescence gluing posters for anti-nuclear proliferation demonstrations to telephone poles, right? Organizing people without the network, without the people finder, it's really hard. And when I like to dunk on refrigerator salespeople and their ads by the sides of airports, but their conversion rate, even for their least targeted ads, are far better than our ads for our anti-nuclear proliferation demonstrations ever were. Now, the ability to find people is a double-edged sword, because the fact that an idea is disfavored and you might suffer social sanction for expressing it does not mean that the idea is a good one. There are a lot of bad ideas that fit really neatly into that niche. If you, for example, believe that the best thing to do of a Saturday afternoon is to dress up like a Confederate soldier and march down the streets of Charlottesville with a tiki torch chanting, "Jews will not replace us," this is a difficult thing to express to your peers without risking substantial social sanction. But the network will help you find those people and will help those people find you. And if you are a conspiracist, someone who is primed to believe that our institutions are lying to us and can't be trusted, that the truth as it is received on an official basis is suspect, and that the real explanation for what's going on in the world is that powerful people are coming together to line their pockets and improve their outcomes at the expense of everyone else, the internet is a really good way for you to find other people who believe that. And the internet is a really good way for people who believe that to find you. So if that's the case, right, if the reason that people believe in conspiracies is that there are more people who are primed to believe in conspiracies, that conspiracism itself is part of our zeitgeist, we should ask ourselves not how does big tech's mind control rate work, but rather, why are people so ready to believe in these conspiracy theories? Well, I think that there are some elements of what conspiracists talk about that are indisputably true, undeniably true. So one of the core tenets of conspiracism is that institutions can no longer do their job. And we live in an intensely technological society in which our safety, our survival, our thriving always turns on intensely technological questions, whether that's whether you should wear a mask or trust a vaccine, or whether it's whether the brakes in your car have been adequately engineered and the anti-lock braking system won't fail at a bad moment because of bad software that was overlooked by a safety regulator and kill you, or whether your car is spewing noxious nitrous oxide that is killing you and the people around you, that whether you know, Volkswagen or another big automaker has conspired to fill our streets with mobile gas chambers, or whether the Boeing 737 MAX is as safe as it should be, even though Boeing was allowed to self-certify the safety of its own emergency software without a regulator intervening, or whether the opioids that your doctor prescribed and tells you are safe are in fact safe, or whether they'll addict you and ruin your life or possibly even kill you, right? Those are technological questions or technical questions that none of us can hope to answer on our own. If you were to become the Shaolin monk of opioids, right? Like if you were going to go off and be the Batman of opioids, so you're going to quit your job, you're going to go off and you're going to learn everything there is to learn about opioids. You go off and you study in a monastery with the opioid experts, and you get a degree and you read all the literature and you learn how to distinguish the good journals from the bad journals and the good papers from the bad papers. And you can double check, you can do the research and double check everything that your local health authority says when they say that opioids are safer than previously thought and you can safely take them. That still doesn't help you when it comes time to get on a Boeing 737 and fly home from the monastery and decide whether or not you're going to take that prescription your doctor offered you before you started off in this adventure. And even if you go and you do it all again to decide whether or not you should get on that Boeing 737 MAX, you have to do it again to figure out whether the distance education curriculum that your local school authority has promised you will be adequate to educate your child while you're on lockdown is itself adequate, right? So we cannot individually adjudicate all the technical claims that are required of us in order to be safe, healthy, and to thrive in an intense technological society. And so rather than telling people caveat emptor, go read the journal articles, figure out if you want to get on that airplane before you get on, and if you don't like it, you know, if it turns out you're wrong, you crash. What we do is we have institutions, we have expert bodies that are impaneled with neutral experts who are governed by strict ethical rules that cause them to recuse themselves when they have conflicts of interest. And they seek out the truth by gathering all of the claims of experts who disagree on what the best course of action is, by sifting through those claims, by describing the basis on which they decided to trust some claims ahead of others, and then by having a mechanism by which claims that were found later to be wrong or that have been superseded by new evidence, by ways in which those truth-seeking policies can be rescinded. Now, over the last 40 years, as we have seen market concentration in industry and wealth concentration in the shareholders of major industries, the truth-seeking exercises that we rely on to be neutral actors who seek the truth to the best of their ability have been slowly but surely converted to auctions. Rather than finding the truth as best as it can be understood, these institutions find the truth as best as they can be compensated for it. So when you ask yourself, how is it that the Sackler family were able to take OxyContin and market it as a safe means of pain control, kickstarting a global opioid epidemic that in the United States alone has killed 200,000 people, more Americans than died in the Vietnam War, you need to look to their regulator. And when you look to their regulator, you find people who have cycled out of industry, who are preparing to cycle back into industry, and whose expert input came from an industry that was so concentrated that it was possible for them to sit down and decide among themselves what they wanted the truth to be. So that the competing claims, such as they were, did not come from a rival firm that spoke loudly because it was in their commercial interest, but came from fringe elements, non-commercial elements on the edges. And to the extent that those non-commercial elements on the edges become a challenge, if there is independent medical researchers at a university or what have you, industry moves in and neutralizes them, often by giving them money, right? Often by taking over sponsorship. because when you are a monopolist, you generate excess rents. And those excess rents can be used both for these direct lobbying efforts and for these indirect processes of suborning researchers and ensuring that all the research that might be deleterious to your interests is underfunded, while the research that supports your interest is well funded. So in the midst of the climate emergency, in the midst of austerity, we are told over and over again by experts and by the institutions who are supposed to oversee those experts that everything is more or less fine, that we can miss that first of all, that the Paris Accord targets are good targets, and second of all, that we can miss them and make it up later. Right? These are obviously false things. Likewise, austerity, starving an economy of money as that economy is collapsing, is never going to improve that economy. It's like telling someone who isn't getting enough hours at their job and can't make the rent that they should work even less. Obviously, that's only going to make them poorer. And certainly we hear it from experts who tell us that the gig economy is a good replacement for stable unionized jobs with defined benefits, pensions, sick pay, and other benefits, or that mergers among competing firms will not produce negative outcomes in the market. So I think that people believe in conspiracies because they're living in a golden age of conspiracies. That the reason that conspiracies have explanatory power is that your life is affected by conspiracies day in and day out. Obvious conspiracies, conspiracies that are routinely brought to light, that you can see out there. And so when someone says, don't trust the institution, trust me instead, the institution is corrupt, what they say has the ring of truth. So when you talk to conspiracists, you will find that for the most part, conspiracists are not lazy. Conspiracism is the energetic pursuit of wrong knowledge, right? When you ask people how it is they can believe in the flat earth, they don't just say, well, look at the horizon, we can tell it's flat, because they've heard all the counter arguments about why the earth can't be flat. They've heard them from people who've gotten up on airplanes and seen the curvature of the earth. I mean, there's never been a moment at which it was less plausible to believe in the flat earth, because there's never been a moment where more people have seen the curvature of the earth with their own eyes. Those people have exotic, baroque, and thoroughly wrong explanations for why the earth is flat, all evidence to the contrary. So these people are not becoming conspiracists because they don't care to know the truth. They're becoming conspiracists because they really want to know the truth, and they don't believe they can trust the truth that comes from the institutions around them. So the epistemological crisis is therefore a crisis of institutions. And that was primarily caused by the crisis in institutions themselves. You know, at this moment in which everything we do takes place on the internet has been dominated by a handful of companies, right? As Tom Eastman from New Zealand says, I am old enough to remember a time when the internet wasn't made up of 5 giant websites, each filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. And the way that happened was not automatic, right? No one came down off a mountain with 2 stone tablets saying Facebook shall buy Instagram. It happened because regulators all over the world trusted the big tech companies when they said that they should be allowed to grow without recourse to the normal contours of antitrust and pro-competition rules. You know, in the US and in the EU, when Mark Zuckerberg assured regulators that he wouldn't mine data from Instagram and WhatsApp to increase Facebook's market share, or that he wouldn't use Instagram as a trap to catch people who were sick of Facebook, as the 15 million people who left Facebook in 2018 were, and to send them off to Instagram, as those 15 million people largely did, they were heartbreakingly naive. In fact, naive is probably too kind a word. The credulous, or maybe willfully blind, is the right word. And certainly when you look at the great and the good who were in power when Facebook was making those risible promises about what they would do after acquiring these giant tech companies, you see that in large part today, they work for Facebook, not least the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time, Nick Clegg, who's now the head of Facebook's international operations, and who I am told by a reliable source is on a salary of $4 million a year for his trouble. The thing about crises is that they multiply one another. The epidemiological crisis doesn't get added to the pandemic, it multiplies the pandemic. The only thing worse than being in the midst of a pandemic is being in the midst of a pandemic at the moment in which public trust in the institutions that can steer us out of the pandemic is at an all-time low. All of this has made our coronavirus crisis far, far worse than it needed to be. And the worse the coronavirus crisis gets, the less credible our governments and their truth-seeking apparatuses appear, and the worse the epistemological crisis grows as well. The pandemic will eventually pass, right? It'll either burn itself out, or we will find a therapeutic, or we'll find a vaccine, and we'll use contact tracing or some other mechanism to be shut of the pandemic. But the vulnerability to pandemics is going to linger. The thing about what's happened is that we have failed to build the capacity through the pandemic to deal with epistemological crises. We're stockpiling ventilators and N95 masks, but we're not stockpiling a mechanism for rigorously finding the truth in a way that third parties can look at and trust, even if they don't understand the actual substance of the deliberation itself. So we need to give people a reason to trust institutions. It's actually far more important to give people a reason to trust institutions, which is to say, to make those institutions trustworthy, than it is to have more N95 masks. Because trustworthy institutions can make determinations about how many N95 masks we should stockpile, and those determinations will be followed. But untrusted institutions that stockpile N95 masks will have those N95 mask stockpiles liquidated. I say this from bitter personal experience. At the start of the pandemic here in California, I learned that in 2006, then Governor Schwarzenegger, hi to all of you Viennese, he was a Grotzer from Austria, our then Governor Schwarzenegger decided wisely that we should spend $200 million stockpiling ventilators, masks, hospital beds, and even 2 portable hospitals that could be erected anywhere in state on 24 hours notice. But after the 2008 crisis, we decided that it was more important to balance the state's budget than it was to have this capacity to address a future epidemiological crisis. And so when the financial crisis hit, rather than spending the $5 million a year it was costing to keep the ventilators' batteries charged, the air conditioning running in the warehouses, and other inventory and logistics controls going, we liquidated the $200 million stockpile, gave it away at pennies on the dollar, and it was scattered all over the world, right? That was because the institution that predicted that we needed to have this stockpile was not given the trust and gravitas that it really deserved. We will repeat those mistakes if we don't address the structural problems that have given rise to the collapse in trust in our institutions. So the way to do that is to restore evidence-based policy by creating pluralistic industries that offer real choice. When we think back to the Trump inauguration, a lot of us remember that photo of the tech leaders sitting around a boardroom table with Donald Trump in the penthouse of the Trump Tower. And many of us, when we saw that, we were just aghast to see these leaders of these companies that we had, if not trusted, at least grudgingly used, all sitting down to meet with Donald Trump. And that was indeed very shocking. But far more shocking, something we should be much more alarmed about, is the fact that everyone that runs big tech fit around one table. Any group that can fit around one big table can easily come to agreements about how to further their interests at the expense of our interests. So with tech, it turns out that we have some pretty easy ways around the monopoly problem. The most important one is interoperability. With interoperability, we have the ability to allow tech companies to enter the market and overtake the dominant firms. You know, when Facebook started, it had this problem that everyone who wanted to use Facebook was already a MySpace user. And although MySpace was ugly and full of bad ads and had all kinds of bad design functions, it had an unbeatable advantage, which was that the majority of people you wanted to talk to were on MySpace. And so as good as Facebook was, if it was empty, it was no fun. And so Facebook addressed this with interoperability. They made a little bot that you could give your login and password to, and it would go and visit MySpace on your behalf and scrape all the messages that were waiting for you on MySpace from your MySpace friends and put them in your Facebook inbox where you could reply to them. And then you could push your replies back out to MySpace with a little footer that said, I'm on Facebook. Why are you still using MySpace, right? MySpace thought they had a walled garden. They thought they had a network effect. What they had instead was a feedlot. They had constructed a pen into which they had conveniently organized everyone that Facebook might want to turn into a Facebook user. So with interoperability, we could do the same thing to Facebook. Right now, we have people who are fielding valiant efforts like Mastodon and Diaspora to try and tempt people away from Facebook. But their pitch to them is stop using Facebook altogether and use Diaspora. It has to be the pitch, because if Diaspora were to make a bot that went to Facebook and got your waiting messages and everything off your feed and put it in your inbox and let you reply to it there and push it out, Facebook would sue the pants off of them. Because Facebook, like every pirate, has become an admiral. Facebook, like every company that has ascended the ladder to the pinnacle, has kicked the ladder away so that no one else can use it. And the way Facebook did that was by suing the next company that tried to do to Facebook what it did to MySpace, a company called Power Ventures. And by securing a judgment that said it's illegal to do what Facebook did to MySpace if you're doing it to Facebook. They closed the door behind them so that they and they alone could do this. Over and over again in the history of tech, we see that the companies that dominate today relied on this form of interoperability, what I've been calling competitive compatibility. That having achieved dominance through competitive compatibility, they now argue that no one should be allowed to do the same to them that they did to others. You know, if you love your Apple products, remember, Apple faced an extinction level event because Microsoft Office for the Mac was really, really bad. And Mac users in Windows environments couldn't share documents with their Windows colleagues reliably. But then Apple solved the problem by reverse engineering the file formats that Microsoft had used for Office and making the iWork suite so that they weren't dependent on Microsoft to allow their competitors to exist as first-class citizens in Office environments. And this rescued the Mac. Today, if you were to do this with iTunes file formats, to make it possible to play back or to replace iTunes or to talk to the iTunes store without using an iTunes client, Apple would sue you for breaking their DRM under Article 6 of the European Copyright Directive and under Section 12.1 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and under the new Mexican copyright bill that's now working its way through the Mexican Congress. They would sue you under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act for violating their terms of service. They might hit you with a patent suit. They would get you 100 ways for doing to them what they did to others. Google exists because they were able to show up at literally every website in the world and say, hey, I'm just an ordinary user. I'm just looking at this web page. I'm definitely not a spider crawling your website, pulling in copies of every web page in order to make an index of it, right? That was Google's origin story. Try to spider Google, try to crawl Google and replace Google by making copies of all of its data, and you will find yourself at the wrong end of an incredibly brutal criminal and civil prosecution. So one of the ways that we can solve the lock-in that our big tech companies have had before is by restoring the tactics they used to overcome the lock-in that their rivals had at their inception. Interoperability is writ large the root of all freedom, right? When countries are able to say, for example, if you don't like the country, leave, people stay, even though they don't like the country. Right? My family are Soviet refugees. When my grandmother left the Soviet Union, she didn't just leave behind her flat. She left behind her ability to talk to her family for more than a decade. It was a very high price that people had to pay in order to go. So in an interoperable society, we allow people to take one piece of their country and swap it out for another one. We have legal reforms. We have different municipal legal regimes, so you can go from one city to the other. We let you take your stuff with you when you go to from one place to another. All through our history, this cause of self-determination is intimately linked with the cause of interoperability. When coal miners say, I don't want to be paid in company script, I want to be paid in dollars, so I can spend them somewhere other than the company store, they are asking for interoperable money. Money that works everywhere, not money that just works in one place. And you know, the thing that happens when we add technology to our existing systems, we can either create these interoperable systems by clearing the way with law and with norms and with markets, or we can allow technology to leverage law to block interoperability in ways that put the wildest dreams of the plutocrats and autocrats of years gone by to shame. You know, today, if you pay someone in company script, you can track everything they buy with it, right? Like if you were to buy a, sorry, I should have turned my phone off. If you were to buy an iTunes gift card, Apple can tell if you give that to someone else, and they can decide whether or not that person's account can spend the gift card that you bought. So back in the days of the company stores, if you were a coal miner who got company script, you could use it to buy corn, and you could sell it to a moonshiner, and the moonshiner would give you dollars. But today, we can sell you corn that you can't sell to a moonshiner. We can make these airtight bubbles around the stuff that you do that are far more efficacious and further reaching than anything we ever did in the old days of lock-in, of the Iron Curtain, of the overreaching boss. And that's really bad news for human thriving and for the human future. But the good news is that tech has this interoperability characteristic latent in it. The very nature of computers is that anything that one computer can do, another computer can do. That software can always be encapsulated in other software and compatibility layers and used to make that happen. And so even as software is permeating every device we have, even as we're seeing devices as diverse as ventilators and phones and tractors that have software that control how you use it, who can research it, and who can repair it, we need to recognize that in the absence of a law that gives companies the right to use technology that way, someone else would come along and make technology that undoes their mischief. That much of the problems that we have stem not from the failure to regulate big tech companies, but in regulating them wrong, in regulating them in ways that allows them to enhance their monopolies. Like all of us, companies seek to minimize their risk. The risk of, the biggest risk that we all face as individuals is the unpredictable actions of others. And so what companies try to do is to use the law to in concert with technology, to constrain our conduct, to constrain the conduct of critics and competitors and customers so that we behave in ways that benefit their shareholders, even if that comes at our own expense. Now, we worry a lot about tech companies constraining our behavior. When we talk about surveillance capitalism and mind control rays, our biggest concern, rightly so, is that tech companies might be depriving us of our free will. But mind control rays are a highly speculative account of what's going on here. Whereas the fact that tech companies with monopolies get to decide what we do, where we do it, who we do it with, and what we can do about it, that is not speculative at all. That's in their annual reports. That's what they tell their shareholders when they convince them to buy more shares in their companies. They cheerfully admit it. They call it walls and moats. They call it commercial advantage. From Warren Buffett to Peter Thiel, every large entrepreneur will privately or publicly admit that the best market to get into is one in which the government will stop people from competing with you. Every other fight we have turns on our ability to reconfigure our technology. If you want to keep your spouse from stalking you, you need to be able to fight stalkerware. If you want to organize a unionization drive on your company intranet, which these days, that company intranet is in your spare room where you are working on lockdown, then you need to be able to control your computer, even if your boss wants to install bossware that spies on you. If you want to be able to organize and to put speech on the internet relevant to social and political issues, we need to get rid of the idea, especially in vogue in the European Union, that the way to address bad speech is with automated filters that are very easy to game, so that good speech and bad speech are indiscriminately, robotically, instantaneously removed before anyone can even object to them. We have to acknowledge that we can either deputize companies to serve as agents of the state, or we can make them small, competitive, and therefore harmless enough that we don't have to worry about them becoming states themselves. Our resilience to future crises requires that we are able to adapt our tools to fast-changing circumstances, even when that gores the ox of a large company or its shareholders. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cory. So we got a few questions in the Q&A section. And if you have any questions and want to ask them directly, just raise your hand and we can unmute you. Okay. There is one question by Ellen Hu. Okay, Ellen.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hi,
fantastic. Wonderful talk. I really loved that. Now, you've kind of laid this a lot of the problems at the feet of sort of these large institutions, large corporations, and kind of the institutional failures. And they're just doing what they should be doing in some sense. They're being greedy, as capitalism says they should. What about, and like at your conclusion, you mentioned that you want sort of these competitive, harmless companies instead of sort of companies with sort of state level power. What about the threat of actual state level actors? So not just the companies themselves. I mean, it seems to me it's been sort of scary over the last maybe 10 years or so, maybe longer. I'm getting old, but as it seems like states have really realized the power of kind of weaponizing a lot of the same techniques that the major tech companies are using. Is there something that we can do about that? Is that a threat? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that this often comes up when people ask why. Well, let me take a step back. So I sometimes talk about this stuff in front of government audiences. Like I've given talks like this at various US military academies, which is funny because I'm a Canadian lifelong anti-war activist. But like I've been to the US Air Force Academy and West Point and stuff to talk about this. And one of the things that you often hear in those contexts is people who say, well, I trust Uncle Sam with my information, but I don't trust Google. And then sometimes, when you go to like these hives of kind of libertarianism like Silicon Valley, you hear people say, oh, I trust Google to take care of my information. They just want to sell me stuff. They're never going to round me up and put me in a gulag, but I don't trust the government, right? What I think both of these accounts miss is that mass surveillance is a public-private partnership from hell. So in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, the Stasi was employing something like 1 in 60 people for a mass surveillance project. It was the most ambitious mass surveillance project in the history of the world. And they probably weren't spying on people enough, right? Because the wall came down. If they had actually been doing enough spying to achieve their goals, there would still be an East Germany. So today, 25, 30 years later, we have the NSA doing the mass surveillance that Ed Snowden told us about. And we don't know exactly how many people in the US are engaged in the mass surveillance project, but we do know that there's only 1.4 million people with top secret clearance, which means that's the largest number of people who could be engaged in mass spying. And assuming to a first approximation that they have about 7 billion people under surveillance through this program, that's like 2.5 orders of magnitude improvement in 25 years. And they didn't get that way by building government capacity. They got that way by allowing private actors to generate their own surveillance capacity for reasons that were largely apolitical and purely commercial, right? Selling us refrigerators. And then by going in and suborning them to be agents of the state. That very large firms are critical to the project of mass surveillance and of mass influence. During the Cultural Revolution, if they kidnapped your father and took him north for re-education and put a bullet through his head, they would send you the bill for the bullet, right? In 2020, you get a bill every month from your mobile carrier for the surveillance that's being used if you live in Xinjiang province to figure out which people need to be rounded up and put in concentration camps. And there are 1 million people in concentration camps in Xinjiang province, mostly Turkic Muslims, Uyghurs, and so on. And the process of interrupting the state capacity to spy on us requires interrupting the private sector's capacity to spy on us. And if we expect states to intervene to minimize the private sector's capacity to spy on us, we also have to break them of their own desire to spy on us, right? The reason that the US government didn't intervene in a more muscular way to prevent the mass surveillance that Ed Snowden revealed, that was being undertaken by Google and Yahoo and the other tech giants that they were using as kind of arm's length surveillance agents, it is at least in part because the NSA needed them intact. And that's not a novel phenomenon. When AT&T first began to behave in anti-competitive ways in the 30s, it was given a lifeline. Rather than being broken up, it was given a kind of regulated monopoly status that had certain conduct restrictions that was supposed to stop them from behaving in anti-competitive and bullying ways towards small telephone co-ops that grew out of the electrification co-ops and towards mom and pop phone carriers. But by the 50s, it was obvious that being an arm of the state did not make AT&T less prone to bullying these companies. And they were even more aggressive than they'd been in the 30s. And the DOJ was inches away from breaking up AT&T when the Pentagon intervened. And they said, we cannot fight the war in Korea if we leave AT&T, if we break up AT&T. AT&T is critical to the war effort. And so AT&T got a new lease on life. And it wasn't until 1982, right? It was 26 years later that the DOJ was finally able to break up AT&T. And by that point, antitrust law was on the way out. AT&T was able to reform by buying all the companies it was broken from. And today it's bigger than ever. And not incidentally, was the single biggest actor in the NSA surveillance that Ed Snowden revealed. So I think that state capacity for surveillance is very intimately bound up, not just in tech firms, but in very large tech firms. Smaller tech firms are obviously easier to bully, right? Like you can show up at a company with 3 employees and a government SUV and some burly dudes with mirror shades and go in and intimidate the 3 employees into doing your bidding. But for the most part, those 3 employees, they can't do much, right? They're not Mark Zuckerberg. They don't have 2.6 billion people under surveillance. And so while it may be easier to bully smaller employees, to smaller firms, it's definitely not impossible to bully large firms, that large firms routinely capitulate to state demands to enact mass surveillance and control in ways that are far more reaching than disinformation campaigns, right? The fact that Apple runs this app store where they and they alone can decide which apps can go on your mobile phone, meant that it was 100% inevitable that the Chinese government would show up and say, ban working VPNs from the app store so we can figure out who to kidnap and put in prison or concentration camps, or which members of Falun Gong we should arrest on trumped up charges and harvest the organs of for party members or whatever. And the fact that Apple caved, and not in secret, right? The fact that Apple publicly said, all right, we're taking the VPNs out of the app store, that was absolutely foreseeable and inevitable. But if there were 1,000 mobile operating systems or 1,000 mobile manufacturers in China or around the world, it would be much harder to prevent working VPNs from existing in China. It would also make the market maybe a little less efficient, but that efficiency is efficiency in the same sense as the efficiency that we had in the healthcare system in the US, where we decided that we only needed the beds that were occupied in a normal week and not beds that might be occupied during a pandemic. That efficiency is really just brittleness. When you look at the countries that have very little technical capacity, but that still manage to enact technological surveillance, mass technological surveillance, you see that they require not just private sector contractors, but massive private sector contractors to make that work. So, the dictator of Cambodia, after nearly losing an election to a Facebook organized resistance in 2013, rather than banning Facebook, suborned them. He hired Facebook experts who know how Facebook's moderation policies work and who are able to goad members of the opposition in ways that don't violate Facebook's policies, and also goad those people into crossing the line so they do violate Facebook's policies and get them kicked off. He can also identify, because he runs the country, which Facebook users in Cambodia are not using their real name. And he can get Facebook to force them off the platform or force them to use their real name. And if they use their real name, he can arrest them and torture them. And so he could not enact that program if there wasn't a single dominant platform in that country. If there was a plurality of platforms, of federated platforms, there would always be corners that he couldn't peer into. But because the whole country is organized around one firm, he can use that firm, he can suborn that firm to his ends. And then when you look at other countries like Ethiopia, where they haven't been nearly as sophisticated, but instead have hired private contractors to break into Facebook, to break into the accounts of the people that they want to spy on. Skype and Facebook and WhatsApp and what have you. You have companies like the NSO Group selling spying tools to dictators all around the world that are used to compromise the mobile devices and get inside the networks of all kinds of activists that allow them to effectively suborn the big firms, even though the big firms themselves are not being enlisted the way they are in Cambodia. You still see that despite the fact that the hacking tools companies are often quite small, that they are parasitic on these giant firms. And if they had to compromise the security of thousands of federated systems, that each of them themselves are being operated according to local needs and in respect of local norms and so on, that they would have a much harder lift making that happen.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay, so the next question is by Moshe Vargi.
Can you hear me? Am I muted? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Again, great talk, but I wanted to see if we can dig a little deep. So to me, there's some very easy decision that we can do. For example, forcing Facebook to cuff up, let's say, WhatsApp and Instagram, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But even if you do that, they still control a platform with 5.5 billion people.
2.6, but yes, yeah.
I think 2.6 is all the platforms together. I think Facebook itself is less, but
okay, sure, yeah.
But again, you can go to Google and you say, okay, cuff up, okay?
Yeah.
But still, even if you do that, they
sure.
remain immensely powerful.
Yeah,
and so
no, you're absolutely right.
What's the next step? How do we, I completely agree with you that we have let them become way too big and powerful.
Yeah.
In some sense, you could argue that is the source of the evil is their being powerful. And
so,
in fact, our history was we stopped Microsoft and IBM from becoming too powerful. Mm-hmm. And that led the flowers, or before that, AT&T. And so we know that this works, actually.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What do we do now?
So I think that I do believe in, let me go back a step here. Last March, I was in Berlin at Republica, and I picked a friendly argument with Margrethe Vestager, who's the competition regulator in the EU, over breakups. And she said, we can't do breakups. They're off the table, really. We can do big fines, but the most we can hope for now is like big fines and conduct remedies. We demand that they behave better, and we hit them where it hurts when they don't. And I thought that was a losing argument, but because eventually they'll just get big enough that they can lobby to have the fines reduced, or they can fight the fines in court for decades, and that'll be cheaper than paying the fines or whatever. That you actually have to reduce their power in meaningful ways. I think that it has to be iterative, though, because her point was, I only have so many dollars or euros to fight anti-competitive conduct, and I can't afford to spend 15 years fighting Facebook in court, right? That'll exhaust my budget. And she's not wrong. I mean, the 12 years that IBM was facing a breakup in the US, every single year of that 12 years, IBM alone spent more on lawyers than the entire FTC had for all enforcement action, right? So these firms have far more resources than the states that are seeking to control them. And so whittling away their power is going to be an iterative process. So we could start, I think, by blocking mergers, right? By imposing strict merger scrutiny. Facebook should not be allowed to buy Giphy. The Sprint T-Mobile merger was ridiculous on its face. Disney should have never been allowed to buy Fox. We can just impose some merger scrutiny. That's particularly important now because with the pandemic, a lot of smaller firms, and not just SMEs, but like the second and third firm in a large concentrated industry, are failing. And the largest firms, the monopolists, have a lot of excess capital, and they are posing themselves as magnanimous knights in white armor who are going to rescue those firms by buying them up. You know, as you see with Google buying up Fitbit and saying, well, yeah, it's true that like we've literally never managed to make a wearable anyone wanted despite trying over and over and over again. And yeah, it's true that Fitbit has all of this data, much of it non-consensual, because Fitbit's secret sauce was they did deals with employers in the US where if you wanted to get health insurance through your employer, you had to wear a Fitbit and to lower your premiums. And so they were able to gather all kinds of information, including information that people input into the app that accompanied it, like their menstrual cycles, their drinking habits, and so on. But you know, what's the alternative? Fitbit is failing. If we don't buy Fitbit, there will be no Fitbit. We know you love Fitbit. Let us say Fitbit. So that kind of merger scrutiny is going to be very important right now. Adding legal protection for interoperators is going to be very important, because one of the things that we do know about big firms is that their dominance is ephemeral if there are smart competitors that can use their advantages against them. You know, when I, in like 2002 or 2003, I was at a conference, small gathering where Sergey Brin spoke. This was back when Sergey Brin came and spoke to small gatherings. And he said, you know, Google will always be trustworthy because it's so easy to switch search engines that, you know, you just update a bookmark. This is back when we had bookmarks. You just update a bookmark and you're not searching Google anymore. Well, he was sort of right. But today, switching Google is really hard, right? Getting Google out of your life is nearly impossible. With interoperability, we can use the fact that Google has dominance against them. We can take all the areas in which they dominate and we can piggyback onto them the way that, say, Static Controls did when they made Lexmark compatible printer cartridges, which caused Lexmark to sue them unsuccessfully, which led to Static Controls getting so big that they bought Lexmark, right? That is one of the patterns that we see historically in tech industries, including very large industries that dominate their field like IBM. And the threat of antitrust action, of anti-monopoly action, is one of the things that causes those firms to exercise forbearance when they're in the midst of one of those struggles, to lay off their most powerful weapons. I mean, many people from Microsoft, the inside of Microsoft, have said that the reason Google exists today is because the unsuccessful antitrust action against Microsoft nevertheless made Microsoft so gun-shy about coming back under the microscope of the FTC, of the DOJ rather, that they held their fire, that they pulled their punches when they were fighting Google, because they thought that allowing Google to grow was preferable to being dragged back into that process. But this is the beginning, right? This iterative process in which we do interoperability, merger scrutiny, breakups, structural separation, that's a really important one. The idea that any of these companies should be allowed to operate a platform and then compete with the people who use the platform is bad policy on its face. I mean, for generations, we had a bedrock idea that if you were a bank, you couldn't own businesses that competed with the businesses you loan money to, rather. If you were a rail company, you couldn't own freight companies that competed with the freight companies whose freight you were shipping. That this would always lead to anti-competitive outcomes. And so we should be imposing structural separation as well. But what we really need are reforms of the system that has produced the wealth concentration, because it's the wealth concentration that leads to the industrial concentration. When you look at the cap tables of these firms and you look at who their major owners are, they're often the same institutions or even the same individuals. So big funds, Vanguard and the other big pension funds, which are managed by the same collection of a small collection of people, or big private funds like Berkshire Hathaway. So and they not only own companies across a vertical, like Universal owns a big piece of Spotify, and they use this to their advantage, right? When Universal bought Spotify, they also accepted a lower royalty for their performers on Spotify, because the money they take in as a royalty, they have to give some of it to their performers. The money they take in as profits from Spotify, excess profits that Spotify earns because they're paying lower royalty rates, they get to give to their shareholders. So the same firms, the same individuals, the same funds are in common ownership of all of these things. Often, like with the big four airlines in the US, they have the same major shareholders. And one of the things that we know from empirical work is that when firms have the same major shareholders across an industry, that they cease to compete with one another. There are ways in which management is signaled by their major institutional investors that they should steer clear of conduct that would undermine the profits across the industry, that they should collude to figure out how to increase their profits at the expense of labor and at the expense of customers. And so that's a next step, right, is to address this common ownership. And I think that we have an advantage in this fight that we haven't yet really articulated or begun to realize, which is that this market concentration and wealth concentration are not merely a problem in tech. They're a problem across every industry. This is the other reason I think we should be skeptical of the tech exceptionalism of tech's critics, who say that the reason that tech is so big is because of network effects and first mover advantages and the unique characteristics of tech. Because if that were true, you would expect tech to be uniquely concentrated. Tech is not uniquely concentrated. We have higher degrees of concentration in eyewear, right? Your glasses are almost certainly manufactured by a company in Italy called Luxottica that's owned by a giant private equity fund that bought every single brand and every single major high street retailer and the largest optical lab and the largest optical insurer in the world, whether it's Oakley or Lens Crafters, whether it's Sears Optical or Target Optical, whether it's Sunglass Hut or Versace or Oliver Peoples or Dolce & Gabbana, they all come from one company, right? They're far more concentrated than tech is. Right? And they don't have network effects and first mover advantages. They just have lax antitrust enforcement. Professional wrestling used to have 25, 30 leagues. 30 years later, there's one league. It's owned by one guy, a billionaire called Vince McMahon. He's a big Trump supporter. And he has used his dominance of the industry to reclassify all of the wrestlers as independent contractors. And he took away their health insurance, which is why GoFundMe is full of people who used to have careers as professional wrestlers, begging their fans for pennies to pay their medical bills as they die in their 50s. And, you know, even if you think somehow there's a network effect or a first mover advantage in eyewear, where is it in professional wrestling? Is it that you corner the market on spandex underwear? So the good news about this concentration is that when you have a bunch of people who have different interests but a common enemy, they can form coalitions. They can turn issues into movements. The copyright scholar James Boyle has a thing he talks about when he talks about the history of the environmental movement. And he says that in the 1960s and 70s, before the widespread use of the term ecology, we instead had issues related to the environment. Some people cared about whales or owls or freshwater or seawater or the ozone layer pollution. And while they thought that the other people working on their issues were doing something quite laudable, they didn't think that it had anything to do with them. And the term ecology came along and it welded all of those disparate issues into a single movement. And the movement that emerged from that became a powerhouse. So today, you know, you're on this Zoom call because you are worried about tech monopolism, but you should also be worried about automotive monopolism and finance monopolism and energy monopolism. And you should be in favor of pluralism, right? That pluralistic movement that we are on the verge of seeing is the answer to the question, how do we weaken these companies? We weaken them by making the profound normative shift that says that no industry should be in the hands of 3 or 4 people, that every industry should be diversified, responsive to local interests, resilient because it is distributed, and attendant to all of its stakeholders and not merely its shareholders.
Okay, thank you, Cory. So we have, I see 6 raised hands and we already, oh wow, it's already 9 a.m. So we can, I think, go a little bit over time because the next session starts at 9:15. So let's
do 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, 2 more. So the next question is by Ratan Mohanta.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep. Is that Ratan?
Yeah,
Ratan.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
All right.
the question I put on the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let me
I
find it
put the
here.
question on the chat box. My question is, what is the future of monopoly capitalism? Is it going to be the normal in future? Is monopoly capitalism going to conquer democratic forms of governments and institutions?
Yeah. So I have to say, like, I'm a as a science fiction writer, I'm a very bad spokesperson for my industry because I disbelieve in all the things that science fiction has made its stock and trade. I don't believe in mind control rays, and I don't believe in predicting the future.
Okay.
I think both of those are mugs games, and
Yeah, I know.
the reason I don't believe in mind control rays is that everyone who's ever claimed to have a mind control ray turned out to either be a liar or deluded. But the reason I don't believe in predicting the future is because I think the future changes based on what we do, right? You know, the optimism and the pessimism approaches are both foundationally fatalism because they
Yeah.
both start from the premise that human agency is irrelevant to the kind of inevitable destiny of the future. And instead, I think that human agency allows us to alter the future we have. So I have a science fiction writing colleague named Ada Palmer, who's a brilliant writer, but she's also brilliant in many other ways. She's a librettist and singer, and she's a tenured professor of Renaissance history at the University of Chicago. And as famous as she is for all the other things she does, she is also locally famous among both Chicago students and historians for this unique exercise she does every year with her undergraduates, where they reenact through a 4-week live action role-playing game the election of the Medici's Pope. And so every year she assigns her students to play out the characters of actual historic personages from the election from Renaissance Florence. She gives them their bios and their backstories and everything they want, just like you would at a dinner mystery murder theater game. And then she gives them 4 weeks to figure out who's going to be Pope, right? And they horse trade and they stab each other in the back and they make deals and they break deals and so on. And at the end of it, she gathers them all and she dresses them up. She has a Google alert for theater companies that are selling off their costumes. So she has amassed this giant wardrobe of Renaissance Italian costuming. And she dresses them all like Renaissance Italians, and they elect a pope. And every year, 2 of the final 4 are the same people, the same historic personages. And every year, 2 are always different. And the reason for that is there are vast historical forces that are acting on the election of the Pope, right? There are people who are always going to be the front runners to be Pope, right? That history would drive us towards. But there are also always people, always slots, always potential outcomes that are determined by the actions that humans take, that are not foreordained. And the thing is that the outcome cannot be predicted, even though the preponderance, the weight of our future sits, or of our history rather, sits on that future, right, and puts its thumb on the scales for one of those 2 people becoming Pope. It is not dispositive. It is not deterministic. It is merely probabilistic. And so I think that a future of monopolism, a future where instead of doing what's true, we do what's profitable for the parochial interests of a small group of plutocrats, is a future that we as the human species will likely not survive in recognizable form, right? It will give us a climate emergency, in fact, waves of climate emergencies that will devastate our civilization. And so I think that the more important question than will things be good or bad in the future is what is a better future and what is the next step we take towards it. Because, you know, if you're drowning at sea, you tread water until someone rescues you. And a lot of the times, most of the times, you won't get rescued. But everyone who was ever rescued treaded water until rescue arrived. That like hope is why you kick, right? Hope is the necessary but insufficient precondition for survival. And so I don't know whether the future is monopolism or not, but I do know that the thing I'm committed to is undoing monopolism, because monopolism has become an existential threat to our species, to our planet, right? To the only planet, to be a bit of science fictional here, the only planet that we know of in the universe capable of sustaining human life. So yeah, I don't know what the future is, because fortune tellers are all con artists, but I do know what future we should work towards.
Okay, so unfortunately we are out of time.
Okay.
So we would have had many more questions, but yeah, we could probably go on another 2 hours with that many questions. So in the name of all attendees, I'd like to thank you, Cory, for your great talk and the great discussion we had.
Yeah.
And thanks everyone else for attending the LogicLounge, and we will hopefully see you at the next edition.
All right. Thank you.